All right, what is going on, everybody? It is Daytona week. The NASCAR season is finally here, starting to feel a little bit like spring. My name is Jordan. I'm the head coach here at SaberSim, and I've got Eric, a data scientist from our team, joining me today. Eric, how's it going?
Doing well, doing well. Excited for the Super Bowl of NASCAR. So
Yes, indeed.
great.
It's always kind of fun to start the season for NASCAR on the biggest event of the year by far. A little bit nerve-wracking on our end, though, making sure all the data and everything holds up, knowing it's the first one, but it is really fun.
Yeah, it should be good. I'm excited. It's always a little bit tilting too with all the crashes and everything. So it's a good kickoff to the year. It's a fun sweat.
Tilting is definitely one way to look at it. I always have a bunch of friends over for Daytona to watch, and I'm not a big NASCAR guy. It's not a big NASCAR group, but I feel like it is probably the most watchable race. I feel like there's probably some like real NASCAR diehards now watching this video. Like, oh God, Daytona, there's so much more NASCAR has to offer than Daytona, but it's definitely my favorite one to watch.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. Yeah.
Cool. Well, let's go ahead and dive in. The reason we've got Eric on the show here today is because he's been working hard on a big model update for NASCAR this year. I was actually looking back at our YouTube history, and I remembered that this is basically the first birthday of our NASCAR model. This time last year, we were just like talking about it for the first time. We created it for the first time, the sim and everything last year. We had a year to work with, a year to backtest, to play with, to see how it went. And I know, Eric, you found some things that you wanted to improve upon for the 2024 season. So let's start. Why don't you just talk a little bit about like what you felt wasn't working last year? What were some of the biggest limitations or the issues that you found as you started to dig in?
Yeah, so I guess like just kind of to back up, in NASCAR, there's sort of like two main ways to get points, like to get fantasy points. Basically, where you're finishing, and then the other way is through leading laps or having fastest laps. And so kind of what I found and what we found was we were like fairly good at the finish positions that we were putting drivers in. That, one sort of piece of the puzzle, we felt pretty happy with how we did that in the previous model. But where we weren't great was in the laps led and the fastest laps. Essentially, and, there wasn't like a ton of true back testing to kind of like validate this and verify this. It was just easy enough to see in the projections where a lot of the time our projections look like Daytona projections for races like Phoenix or like some places where it's like harder to pass. Guys can get out to the front and just stay in the front forever. And so kind of what that would do is we basically really liked drivers who had like very good place differential points, place differential point potential, I guess. And so, a lot of the lineups that were generated were sort of stack the back type lineups. And, essentially we just weren't making the guys starting at the front, good enough, basically.
Gotcha. So what was the impact of that like on DFS lineups? Did that make people like a little more projected well on average but lacking upside? Like I'm trying to think about like what the DFS impact of some of those issues were.
Yeah, so DFS wise, essentially if you started in first place, your ceiling in our projections was like artificially capped.
Gotcha.
Essentially. Basically, if we're only going to give out a max of like 40 laps led to someone, it's hard to like get all of those, finish first, and then that's your score versus someone who can just go from 36th to 3rd or whatever. And so in the new model, like the change to that is basically the laps led for those drivers who are starting at the front. It's just a lot more like concentrated on a race by race basis.
Gotcha. So yeah, talk a little bit more about that. Like, what were kind of some of the big steps to improve the sim to start doing that correctly?
Yeah. So again, like there's sort of the finish positions, which we changed just like very slightly. Essentially, it incorporates a little bit more of the like starting position of the driver. Obviously, depending on the track, and like that's a whole nother sort of deal. But just like a very slight change to that, which was kind of where we started. Another thing that helps us with laps led, and then obviously that finishing position, is just we wanted a way to determine like how easy it is to pass at a certain track. Because one of the other things in NASCAR is like the tracks really make an impact on strategy, on like how DK points sort of get dealt out to everyone.
Yeah.
And we definitely just like weren't accounting for that enough in the old model. So
and go ahead. Sorry.
No, you go ahead.
Well, I was going to say it's kind of like a double-edged sword there too, of like the tracks that make it harder to pass make leading for a lot of laps both easier, and it's harder for the place differential people to actually get that type of upside. Like they kind of or tracks where it's very easy to pass and there's a lot of passing, it's a lot harder for first place to hold on to that for the entire race, which also then makes it a lot easier for the place differential guys to get their place differential by the end of the race. So it seems like getting this right and understanding the differences between these different tracks is really, really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, like that was something that we weren't doing very well last year, where we felt like every track was closer to a restrictor plate, Daytona and Talladega. And so, yeah, we were just significantly underrating the top guys, basically. So yeah, we basically built out a new way to sort of compare the tracks, determine how hard it is to pass, how easy it is to pass. And that really went into our new way of determining the laps led for a race. So for that, like the way that we sort of start is we split the race into 3 stages, just like NASCAR does. For the first stage, we're basically like, picking who's going to lead that lap based on stuff like starting position, like the sort of driver skill, that type of stuff. And that's going to determine like the first lap of the race. And then from there, what we can see is like, okay, how much of an impact does leading the first lap of the race have on leading the second lap?
Gotcha.
And so on and so on. And so previously we sort of didn't have that like correlation type. I don't know if that's exactly what you would call it, but
yeah.
What I think of it is it's kind of like a snowball where you really start to like, if you lead the first lap, you're more likely to lead the second. If you lead the second, like obviously you're more likely to lead the third. And so it just kind of like grows and grows and grows. And yeah, again, that's something that we just weren't doing last year that, we now have implemented. So it's the laps led is more of like a lap by lap sim, I guess, as opposed to previously where it wasn't.
Gotcha. So yeah, I mean, what it seems like is we're really now building out like the idea of a script for each race in our simulations. Like we talk about the game scripts a ton in our NFL content about how important it is. You can't just drop yourself into, the middle of the third quarter and say, okay, this is what's likely to happen next without really knowing kind of what the entire game looked like before it. It seems very similar here where, it's not just enough to say like, okay, if we were in lap 260 and this was the order of where each driver was, this is what would happen next. You do need to actually know how you got there in that individual sim to kind of understand, how likely it is that somebody's going to keep leading or what's kind of come before that in the race. Do you agree with that idea there?
Right. Absolutely. Like, I think this piece of like taking into account what has happened in the race, like previous or like to that point, that really was like the big sort of piece that we're missing.
Yeah.
And you know, even there's obviously, we look back to like the previous lap when we're assigning sort of the current lap led, but when we get into like stage 2, we're looking at, oh, like what percentage of laps did they lead in stage 1? And so there's all of this like correlated impact that we find throughout the race that really like informs the rest of it. And you know, I think too, it's really helped with correlations too, kind of to your point about the race script, where, you know, in the first stage, like a lot of the guys who are fighting for the laps led are obviously the guys who are starting higher up. So, you know, they're competing for that single lap led in the first stages, versus when you get later in the race, you know, the guy starting first could be fighting against the guy who started like 12th.
Right.
And so there's the correlations between drivers is also just like changed and more accurately reflects like when drivers can actually lead laps.
Gotcha. Yeah, I know last year we had talked a lot about like the distributions of drivers in particular being a good reason why having these single race simulations was optimal, and why average projections were kind of so poor. Like you see Joey Logano's here graph, right? Like 18.95 as an average projection does not really do a good job of indicating what the actual distribution of outcomes looks like here. And actually, I mean, the distributions, as you mentioned here at the start of this, have also probably gotten a lot better, especially at the high end. But I think the way I'm kind of thinking about this now is not only now do we have like a strong distribution for what individual drivers' outcomes look like, but we really have a much better idea of what the race looks like in the event that Joey Logano does well here in this particular race, for example.
Yeah, definitely. I think, you know, obviously this race isn't the perfect example, just because it's hard to lead like a ton of laps here. But the 99th percentiles, and yeah, so Jordan just flipped to trucks here, which this is a race from last year, but run with the new model. The 99th percentiles are like significantly improved, where, you know, previously, so Dean Thompson, that would have been a guy that we like absolutely loved last year.
Yeah.
Where it's like a good driver starting in the back. You know, we're going to love his place differential upside, which we still do, right? Like in the new model, that's still there. He's starting basically right at the back. But in the old model, this Nicholas Sanchez, his 99th percentile would have been like way, way, way down there. Just because, you know, we basically weren't giving him enough laps led. And so if you scroll over, like we're at 40. My guess would be last year we were at like 14 or something like that. Like there's been a pretty significant change.
Yeah, and I was playing around with this earlier here, and the correlations is something else that jumped out to me as well. Like we're picking up a decently sized negative correlation now to the other drivers that are starting the race at the front, right? Like that battle, especially early on, to kind of establish that position to be kind of the leader, at least through the early parts of the race, is important. And only one driver can do that. So we get that negative correlation over the course of all of our different sims.
Yeah. It like, and again, it just intuitively, like you just said, it makes sense where those guys are fighting over the same laps, like almost for sure, versus, you know, someone who's starting in 16th, like they have to make their way up through the field in order to compete for a lead lap. So, you know, it'll just take them longer. Basically, they're not competing for laps 1 to 10. You know, it's later on. So,
Yeah. So we've talked about like the race scripts here kind of getting better, and then also the upside of the percentile projections for different drivers getting better, the correlations getting better. What was the process that you used like after this had been implemented or versions of this had been implemented to backtest, to like verify that this actually was an improvement, was a step in the right direction?
Yeah, so we didn't do sort of like a full backtest. Like, essentially with some of the other models, we're kind of at the point where every change is pretty incremental. And so you really want to like backtest on the season or whatever and ensure that like, yeah, this is making the model better. For this specifically, and just, it being a little bit of a smaller sport, and also our starting point was a lot lower than the other models. I basically just went through and I was like, I'm going to look at, with the new model in place, I'm going to look at like the easiest passing tracks, and then like the hardest passing tracks, and just run a bunch, look at percentiles, look into like single sims of that race, and just make sure that those make sense. And just, essentially kind of eyeball it a little bit and be like, I mean, where I ended up was like, this is significantly better.
Yeah, and it should, I think with the 99th percentiles too, that seems like a data point that kind of should be like the person that wins the race, I would assume in a typical field, should be kind of at or near one of these top percentile outcomes. And you would assume probably no other drivers or very few other drivers are also there, unless there was like some crazy place differential, like 35th to second finish or something like that.
Yeah, for sure. And so so last year, like part of kind of what spurred the project on was we did have a bunch of drivers exceeding their 99th percentile, like a lot more than we would have thought. And again, it's not like we were, it's not like we did a full back test to kind of figure that out. It was like, oh, like Kyle Larson is exceeding his 99th percentile in 5 of the 20 races. Like, something's probably going on here. And so the with the new model, the ones that I tested, I basically went through, looked at actuals, compared them to our 99th percentiles, just to ensure that like, it looked pretty good, which it did. I think there was one with Truex who led like 300 laps and like won it all. And so he exceeded his 99th, but I looked into the data and we had like, it was like his 99.7th percent.
It was in the sims.
It was in there.
Yeah.
Versus like, especially last year, like we wouldn't have even been close to, an 120 point race or whatever it was. So yeah, just in terms of like figuring out how we know it's better, because we started kind of like down here, it's just a lot easier to tell that like this is a big improvement.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I mean it sounds definitely like the races as we get further into the season are where you're really going to see this the most. Like Daytona's kind of crazy, and I think people are obviously going to be very excited for it this Sunday. I am, but the biggest improvements from what we would have had last year to what we have now will be on some of these other races as the season goes along.
Yeah, definitely. Like Daytona, even, I ran the old model for Daytona and then ran the new model, and there's not a huge change. Like, I mean, there's a little bit, but like it's not all that significant versus some of the other races that I was testing on. We had like guys in first place who, like, where their average projection was jumping 13 points, which is like a lot. Their 99th percentile is jumping 20 points, which like that's significant. So definitely the changes will have more of an impact as we get into the harder to pass racetrack.
Were there any particular like obstacles you ran into making these updates? I think a lot of times our listeners and viewers get kind of interested in the almost development side of some of the model stuff. Any obstacles you ran into, or anything that you just found tricky that you had to overcome?
Yeah, so the NASCAR data is like a little bit weird.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, like to take a true like lap by lap sort of like report that you get from NASCAR, just the data just like doesn't sort of line up.
Mm-hmm.
And so for this, what we actually landed on doing was we took kind of like the race summary and then built out a lap by lap like table. So for example, we had, Denny Hamlin, his like in the Daytona 500 last year, his laps led were 30. Essentially what we were doing is we're taking that one row and turning it into like 30 rows where he led a lap in whichever stage that he
Mm-hmm.
like led his laps. And then the rest, where he still has an entry, but has like a 0 in his lead lap column. So basically we were like building out the lap by lap like report of the race, I guess.
Yeah.
Which that was like tricky. It involved a couple of like assumptions to, make sure that like the laps led were sort of like lining up correctly and all that stuff. But that definitely was the most difficult, just
Yeah.
because like, you're turning basically a race report of like 36 drivers into 36 drivers all get 300 laps of data.
Yeah.
So
Gotcha. Cool. Yeah, I imagine it was tricky because I think I am grasping about 60% of it. So I'm sure it was a challenging problem to solve. So one of the things that I picked up, following NASCAR last year and playing it really in DFS for the first time was like this idea of driver skill and how that's kind of shifting, changing over the course of the season. Do you want to talk a little bit about, like, it's obviously the start of the year this year, how our kind of start of season sense of driver skill begins and how that adjusts as different races go on throughout the year?
yeah, for sure. So that one of the interesting things about NASCAR is just you sort of have like two like skill impacts, I guess. So you have the driver skill,
Mm-hmm.
which to me that's more of like how well has the driver done at the track and like sort of that type of
Mm-hmm.
stuff. And then you have the equipment that they're in. So, their team, the like the physical race car that they're in, like there
Yeah.
definitely is better, like better cars than other cars.
Mm-hmm.
And so for us, like I think we're pretty good at getting the like manufacturer and the equipment sort of like impact or that factor accounted for, and kind of updating as we learn sort of the new information of the season or whatever it is. Where I think there is like uh, some room to improve upon it is with the like driver specific at the track that they are accustomed to or
Mm-hmm.
something like that, where we could be a little bit behind in just we would want to make sure that impact is like for sure real, versus I think sometimes we can just be a little bit slow in understanding like that impact and that a driver is like good at a track.
Gotcha. Yeah, I
So
mean, it makes sense. Just real quick, like
mm,
with each race happening once a year, even if there are like, multiple events at a given track in a given year, you don't have a ton of data to work from to know just like, is this driver just, really in tune on this particular track. It things that look like signal could very easily be noise with that kind of sample size.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and so like the other thing too is just at the start of a season, obviously we're still like relying pretty heavily on like last year's data and that type of thing. Well, obviously like we'll update our assumptions and that type of thing, but definitely at the start of the year, like if there's something that you see or like there's something that comes out on a specific team where maybe they've really fallen off, or they're doing really well, like we also could be slightly behind on that. But kind of as the season goes on, we'll be more confident in where those like driver skill or that like skill ranking is at. Yeah, just as we get more data.
Gotcha. I'm sure that you are pretty excited to get into some contests here this week and as the season gets started here, test out the new model, see how things are looking, get some lineups built. What are you kind of planning on doing with your builds to make any adjustments, add any value, things that you think we're not capturing perfectly well, things that just on the DFS side, like that you want to make sure you're addressing, like duplication or anything like that? I'm just curious, like kind of a sense of what your process is going to look like here for building lineups on Sunday and in the early parts of the season here.
Yeah, so I think from like a projection standpoint and that sort of piece of the build, I'll be pretty like I won't be making significant projection adjustments.
Yeah.
One thing that I do, and you guys actually touched on this in, I think it was a Super Bowl video, but with contest sims now, I think it's really good for NASCAR just because you really do want like the single sim, like that really like matters in terms of the fantasy points, right? The correlations. And so previously, like the only way, well, like before contest sims, the only way really to access that is like sim optimals. But now with contest sims, obviously, like we're using the single sims in the contest sim. So it'll be a pretty like lightweight process for me up until I do my contest sim. And then after that, it's just going to be some sort of duplication measure. I think a little bit of it will just be like a manual check of some of the lineups. I think stuff like salary you can kind of mess with. Even like a geomean ownership once we're kind of at more normal races can be something. But I think I'll do a lot of that, or I'll do a lot more sort of like post contest sim, post like build, I guess, as opposed to much with the inputs themselves.
Gotcha. Yeah. And honestly, the contest sims probably took a huge step here in terms of their ability to identify and accurately like grade ROI for these lineups. Anytime, our scripts are getting better, or the outlier outcomes that, tend to matter a lot in DFS are getting more accurate, or we're getting a better picture of what those actually look like, I think contest sims just takes like an exponential step up, because they matter so much for how lineups profit and what those situations look like when they're profiting, that like it just makes a huge difference.
Yeah, for sure.
Cool. Awesome. One other question I wanted to ask you here. I'm sure you were pretty deep into the NASCAR sim and the model as you were working through this. Is there anything that also jumped out to you that we didn't have time for the start of this season, but that you see as kind of an opportunity to continue to improve? Maybe something that we might be doing mid-season or at the start of next year that you think we could still work on or improve upon?
Yeah, so I think, there's always things to like, NASCAR's, it seems silly because it's a bunch of cars like going in a circle, but it is amazing how like complex that it can become when you're trying to, predict the outcome. So there's a couple things. Like I think pit stops are something that would be really interesting to sim.
Yeah.
I know like those, like in NASCAR, you can stop like 8 times in a race. And if you're losing a second on each of those, like 8 seconds is significant. And that even with the new lap sled stuff, it's like it all kind of feeds together where, if you're first off pit road, then you're leading more laps. And so, it just builds and builds and builds. In the same like vein a little bit, I think some of the pit road penalties, maybe that's just because I notice them when I am playing DFS and my guy gets a penalty and then goes from second to like a lap down. But that would be another thing I think that would be kind of interesting, where again, it's a little bit of like an outlier type event, but that is some of the stuff that like we want to get right, so that the 1% sims can be more accurate. So I'd say those two.
And are we simming Rex at the moment?
So like we are, we basically pick which cars are going to DNF.
Gotcha.
There isn't, there isn't like and if you click into like a distribution, you sort of can see.
Some of these NASCAR distributions are so funny.
I'd pick a higher guy. So like we are simming it in that way. It's for the most part, it's like what does the track, is it like a Daytona where lots of people are crashing, or is it somewhere else? And then a little bit of starting position, just because basically like the idea is when you're moving up in the field, it's a lot easier to get collected in a crash or something like that, versus if you're running at the front, it's a little less likely.
Gotcha. Cool. Well, I'm very excited for the start of this season here. Anything else that you wanted to add? Any final thoughts about the updates here, just the start of the season, general NASCAR strategy? Anything we didn't get to here today?
Not necessarily. I think the one thing that I want to touch on and maybe emphasize is just like the difference in the races and like the track differences, where like Daytona plays almost more like NFL Showdown, versus some of the other tracks can play like closer to maybe like an NBA Showdown or something like that. So I think just like keeping that in mind, where your lineups are going to look very different depending on the track that we're at. And that's not like wrong or anything. It would be wrong like last year where they sort of look the same no matter what. But I think like that would be, just something to be mindful of and to think about when you're constructing or, doing a little bit of like auditing of your lineups, maybe even when you're looking through contest flashback in terms of like duplication and stuff like that, is just it is just the sport of NASCAR, but within it there's sort of the different like funnels of races.
That's really interesting. And I think especially knowing that this update made such a big jump in the right direction there with picking up on the differences of the tracks and how those races actually tend to play out. It makes me really excited for this season. And I think, if anything, if you played last year, used SaberSim and got in the habit of maybe kind of a stock set of rules that you were consistently going back to get lineups you like, I think, general rule of thumb, whenever we do a big model update, it's a good idea to relax some of them, or to at least just take a look at what the lineups now look like without them, especially as we get into different tracks, different styles of races throughout the year, because they may not be as necessary as they were in the past, and they may actually be hindering the sims from finding some of the optimal lineups here with the new update. So cool. All right. Well, thank you all for watching. Eric, thank you for coming on and talking to me about these big updates here. There will be other NASCAR videos here dropping before Daytona. I will also be linking the videos from last season in the description of this one. If you want to hear a little bit more about where the model came from in the first place, we've got a great interview from last year talking about like the first week of this model being up, and also some helpful strategy and content from last season that is still very useful as kind of a strategy guide heading into this year. But Eric, good luck on Sunday. Thanks again for coming on, and we'll see y'all later.